But the story shifts to China, and there's this famous healer in China, and there's this fellow who's broken both legs, and asks the great healer to come and mend one of the legs. And the great healer comes and labours on that leg and then leaves. Even though the other leg was broken, the great healer hadn't touched this leg. And everybody wanted to know why this great healer hadn't mended this other man's leg. And the answer came back that permission was only given to work on the one leg. And by this great healer meant not to be unsympathetic, but that we would never enter a house unless we're invited. And that permission was only given to work on the one leg. And that we are not to know how it is that others are learning the lessons of this life. And that some people are learning in sickness and other people are learning in health. And by this we mean not to be unsympathetic, but to ask permission. So you will always find me asking you for your permission. If something is there, I'll say, would you mind, can we go below the surface with this? Would you like to go below the surface? Is there something there that you would like for us to explore? So that the person is party to the process and that you are not acting on the person. So some of us here are involved in working with people in massage and body working. And in Ayurvedic medicine, this principle goes all the way through to not even touching somebody, moving them in a way that would be corrective before the person's energy was harnessed to move them. So someone came into bed and you could see that they were like this, and this person was lying down on the floor like this or on the table. Ned would not straighten that person straight away. Ned might make that situation just a little worse. So what he noticed was that there was like a contraction on this side, and then what Ned did was shift the person just a little bit more like that. And the minute that he saw the person wanting to straighten themselves, then he would go with that energy. So that you're harnessing what it is that the person is doing there. So I think for the most part how we are helping truly us ordinary people, the way that we help truly is by what it is that we model. And that living in New York, I see people begging for money. They don't have any shelter, and they have no material possessions, nothing. Some of these people are perfectly content where they are. Not so much wanting or doing something about where they are, but perfectly accepting the situation where they are. And I think that having lived in New York, I've learned to respect these people and not so much look at them like they should have a job or they should have a home. They should have a house that they live in. And that I'm equal. I'm equal to these people and they're equal to me. And I see them as my equal completely. Not passing judgment over them. in the position that they're in at all. And not so much feeling sorrow or pity, because I know that mostly I'm sensing that people are not so interested in this. A mentor of mine, really quite an older man, shared a story with me one day, us, in this garden, and we could see that he was near the last legs of his life, that he might live another month or so, not much, and that he was in the last legs of his life, and that he had been a great saint in his life. Amazing. And now here he was, feeble, and letting it show that he looked like he was depressed. And about a week passed by and he was this way, and one of the students, when he was in the garden, came over and wanted to know why he was looking this way. And this mentor of mine kind of cussed this student out a little for highlighting the fact that he was not so well, and told this student that he was in the last legs of his life. And why it was that this student had come over and highlighted this more so for him to see. And then he stopped and he sat down and he said to us that he would let us into his heart, and he would share with us what it was that was in the depth of his heart. And he said that for some weeks now he'd been thinking of his life, and when he looked into his life he regretted something that had happened. When he was younger, he'd been asked by the Prime Minister of Greece to come over and to be with them, and he'd sailed from Lebanon, and that he'd fallen in love with this woman whilst he was in Lebanon. And in choosing this post to go to Greece, it meant that he would be leaving Lebanon, and he made the decision that he would leave Lebanon. And whilst he was at sea, he was stricken with remorse over having made that decision, that he realised that he loved this woman, and that he'd made this decision to go to Greece, and that this was not in his heart, that this woman was in his heart, and that he had vowed to see if there was a way that he could go back one day and find her, and that was what he was going to do. And so the whole trip he was in remorse and grieving over having made this decision. And when he got to Greece and he came up to the front door of the Prime Minister's house, the servant opens the door, and here's the servant weeping, crying and weeping, sobbing. And my mentor asked what it was that had happened, and this servant said that the Prime Minister's daughter had passed away, and that everybody was grieving. And he was struck again deep within himself that he had been in remorse all this trip, and that now he'd come to Greece and he was confronted with this remorse and this deep sadness. So eventually he was with the Prime Minister, and other people were, and people came and went, and eventually he was the last person there with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister asked him to stay on. So he stayed on for a little while, and then he went back to Lebanon. And he looked at this student, and he looked at us, and he said that he didn't know, couldn't make sense of this grieving. And then he said to us that when he died, he wanted us to celebrate. And that that's what he wished, that he wanted us to celebrate. So, in those celebrations that you go to in your life, there's this place of celebration. There's no place there for death and dying. That when you are in the act of celebrating, that there's no place for death and dying. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into full body calibration, and from now on you're going to be using full body calibration to understand people's strategies, and we're going to become quite fine at discovering what it is that occurs, that initiates the sequence that a person goes through in their head, and this is really going to further your understanding of the strategies that people are using. So what we're going to have, I think what we're going to do is Johnny's going to come out here and he's going to go through full body calibration, and then we'll have somebody come out and you'll share a story with us, and probably you'll hardly even get through 2 or 3 sentences without someone saying freeze, and then you'll share what you've got, what you've seen. Okay, so why don't you do this now, Johnny?
When we had our early morning cram session on Friday, we talked a little about this. The first thing that really comes to me is about the power of the brain and the structural complexity and sophistication of the brain, where we would have an average of, say, 50 billion neurons in the brain, little cells, each one of which connects to an average of 25,000 other cells, so that there's enormous capacity for information flow and for storage and retrieval. There are over 1,000 trillion connections in the brain. And this is a man up in Canada named Pinfield, who used to do operations on people, and this guy was very curious. So when he was inside the brain, he'd take a tiny little electrical stimulus device and touch a place, and the person on the table would say, "Oh, I remember the baseball game I went to when I was 10 years old. It was this team, and I was wearing this, and my friend was wearing this, and the score was this and this." The person had total recall of everything that was there. And this guy did a bunch of experiments like this and found out that people would have recall of things that had happened in their lives that they weren't even conscious of at the time. I told you the story of one person remembering the number of telephone poles that he walked by on the way to school when he was 6 years old. At the time he wasn't even conscious, but when he got stimulated here, all of this came back. And it's currently thought that every single thing that we've ever seen or heard or smelled or tasted or touched or perceived in any one of our senses is stored accurately in our brains. If this is true, you can imagine the power that we have. And it would be just a matter of retrieving what's stored, because it's all in there. Now, the brain uses other mechanisms to retrieve. We talked about eye accessing cues, and you can think of your eyes as little switches, so that if you would look up in one direction, there would be a switching occurring that would shunt the electrical stimulus to a certain part of the brain where this is processed. And if the eyes go somewhere else, it sets up processing in a different part of the brain. So that eyes up like this would lead us to process visually, and eyes down like this, we'd begin to process kinesthetically. And this is standard NLP knowledge. What we're doing here and what whole brain functioning has added to this is the idea of every part of the body as a way to access ways of processing in the brain. So that just as the eyes up tell us to process visually, a hand movement up in the visual space sets up the same kind of processing. A hand movement down here, a hand movement in any one of the psychographic spaces, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and internal dialogue spaces, sets up processing of that type. Hands, just really any part of your body, what your foot's doing, a little tapping down here or a movement of the knee down in kinesthetic, sets us up to be doing that and actually gives a signal to everyone on the outside of how a person's processing. So you would suspect if somebody is listening to you and doing this, no matter where their eyes are, that they might be having internal dialogue while they're having a conversation with you.
Okay, so what is it about the foot moving like this that enables us to know that it's internal dialogue? How is it disconnected in the brain?
It's on the lower left-hand side of the body.
This is... Okay. Is this for anybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on the lower left-hand side of the body, which would be also related to.
So that a movement on the right side of the body, anywhere on the right side of the body, is largely being influenced by the left hemisphere and is priming that hemisphere and telling it to operate and being operated by it.
Constructing things, constructing.
And any movement on the left hand of the body is wired to the right hemisphere, which is about space, the big picture of things, getting information as a whole, all at once. Whereas this hemisphere would be about step by step by step sequencing. Like you're making plans or you're moving your body in a certain way, making a sequence of things. Because memory is largely processed here, a movement on this side of the body, activating this hemisphere, would be about visual, auditory memory, internal dialogue. And since the future is something that we construct with the left hemisphere, movements over here on the right-hand side connected to this hemisphere would be about the future. Visual construction, visual memory, and kinesthetic motor sequencing.
Visual construct, auditory construct, and kinesthetic construct. The ability to sequence something kinesthetically. Okay, and basically the quadrant would be when I lift my hand above my breast line here, I'm going much more into a visual mode. And what kind of vision is this that I'm using? If I bring my hand up here? Visual construct. So what does that mean?
Creating vision.
Yes, so here's an example. What could I be doing up here?
Giving someone an instruction. We're going to go this direction.
Possibly. This is where I could see a blue tea kettle running across the table. Right? And this might not be something that I've seen before, but this is something that I could construct. And generally, we're putting together a visual picture from words. When you see somebody coming up over here, right into this quadrant, or addressing this quadrant up here, basically this is where we would go to put together a picture actually. So if Johnny asked me, had I done something, and I was going to rely on my memory, and then he saw me go up like this, he would know that quite possibly, I actually have not gone to the memory, but that I'm constructing it.
Making it up.
I'm making it up. Right. And so when the hand comes down, or the eyes come down into this quadrant, or there's movement in this quadrant over here, so down below the breast line and in between the hip line and the breast line, my hands are in here. What is this here?
Auditory.
Right, auditory. Alright, and what is that?
I can hear the birds chirping, the blue tea kettle.
Okay. No. Because the birds are not over here.
You're creating sound. Constructing what you're going to say.
Constructing. Okay, so it's auditory construct over here. Right? So give us an example of auditory construct. What is auditory construct?
Telling yourself something?
Something you'd like to hear?
Yes, actually it wouldn't be inside telling self. You would be in the process of constructing something to say, something that you had not heard before, something that you were just about to sequence. That's where this is over here.
Prepared for
Something that you've actually heard yourself say before is over here. But something that you would be constructing to say is primed by bringing your hand out over here. You're priming that aspect of the brain, matter of fact. So this is aiding, like an aerial is being tuned, like the length of an aerial in a radio. As you turn the dial, basically the length of the aerial is changing so that a wave band that's coming in, it's able to pick up exactly that wave band. Well, that's what the hand is doing over here to the brain.
When you're in that mood, are you thinking in sentence, syntax?
Yes, you more than likely are constructing something. You're putting together something with words, and you're actually putting it together. If it was over here, like this with my eyes level and my hand out over here, or my eyes more or less straight ahead and my hand over here, alright? More or less this quadrant here is auditory memory.
Does this be like where if you're telling a story that you've already told before?
Yes. Right. History, your history, your ability to put to language something that's from history, from your past. All of this is over here. So what is over here? That.
Past history.
Yes, and memory. So give us an example of that.
Example of what you remember over here?
Yeah, like what?
What you heard?
What you had heard before. What you'd heard yourself saying.
Exactly.
What you'd heard somebody else say. Possibly something that you had read.
I'm doing this while I'm saying that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
when we hear music that we've heard many times, this is the...
Yes.
Okay. Now I have a question for you or Johnny. Have you ever observed people who make their living as psychics or who are giving trance information?
Absolutely.
Now, have you noticed that they come either from their memory, where they're rehearsing something, or is it visual or auditory construct when they're in, or is there no?
Most of these people who are channeling, you'll notice that they've got direct tap to their right hemisphere, and they're processing from the gestalt. They look at the way that you come into the room. They lay some cards out. They look and see how you relate to these cards. Somebody's flipping through the cards and a card comes out. Maybe it's the Fool. Maybe it's death, transformation, whatever it is. They're looking to see how you relate to those cards, and they know instantly.
They are determining what you think of yourself.
Yeah, they're reading you very much. Most of these people you'll notice actually, like for instance, what is this fellow who's on a tape? Lazarus. Right now, when Lazarus goes into to channel, you'll see really that you'll actually see him come into that aspect of his body. Matter of fact, his head contracts to the left a little bit, and you even see him, and even muscles on this side of the face start to twitch a little bit as he really shifts into this aspect of his brain to be able to completely tap into universal intelligence. Okay, sorry, John.
I remember during Watergate when Nixon would get on TV and somebody asked him a question about what has actually happened here in the past, and he'd kind of go over here to memory, auditory memory, and then he'd go like this. And then he's really shifted his eyes quite a bit, and he'd shift his eyes from side to side in auditory range. So there might be something happening like going back to remember what really happened, then going into construction to create what it is that he's going to say really happened, and just making a shift.
That's how we get the word shifty.
Shifty eyes. people that there's something about trust with that.
So what about shiftiness? What is that? What's going on?
Lying.
Trying to match the past with the future.
Yes, in this situation, right?
What you agree with.
I'll just share something with you so that you're aware of it in your body and with others. When you are seeing a lot of accessing cues, the person's everywhere. I'm going to exaggerate, right? You know, they're talking to you and you see them kind of doing this. I'm really exaggerating, okay? Because it's subtle. You can know the person's really dissociated. Because the frequency of accessing cues, when the frequency of accessing cues is minimized, this person is much more in an integrated state. And as we become adults, we really learn how to concentrate. And before this time, you'll notice that Andy, for instance, you know, he's aware of everything outside, and he's aware of everything because he's like all over the place. You know, if he went to the restaurant or something, he would know what music had just been played because he's all over the place, more or less. Right? And as we become adults, we slowly learn how to tune in and focus in on something. And you'll notice more or less when someone truly is focused on something, there's very few shifts occur at all. So what happens between the pilot of an aircraft and the co-pilot when they're taking off about blink rate? Anybody know? What would you imagine? The difference between the co-pilot and the pilot as far as blink rate and taking off?
Pilot's blink rate will go down now.
Yes.
About that,
And what about the two, the co-pilot and the pilot? What would be the difference between the two?
The co-pilot speed up.
Huh?
The co-pilot speed up.
Well, yes, okay. Not so much that the co-pilot speeds up, but the difference, the major responsibility for getting the aircraft off the ground is the pilot. And so you'll notice that the blink rate of the pilot is much smaller and fewer than the co-pilot because of that responsibility.
because of stress.
Yes. You'll notice that when you're with others and you ask them a question, the minute that the person gets the question, often then you'll see a blink. But if you are talking to somebody and you notice, you know, especially if you ask them something and then you can see that they're kind of blinking, right? This is an indication of dissociation. The person's actually dissociating. So anyway, the one thing here that, as we go on, Johnny's going to go on, is that these accessing cues are there when the person's in an associated state. And it's possible that somebody could be doing something else if they're dissociated. I have never seen anybody access information differently when they're in an associated state, that you bring them into the present tense, that they're in an integrated associated state. I've never seen anybody access differently. Everybody has their heart on their left side. Everybody has their liver on their right side. Everybody has their spleen on their left side. And everybody's left hemisphere is much more connected to the base of the brain than the right hemisphere. The posterior horizontal ramus, which is a fold of tissue, is much higher up on the left side, indicating a greater amount of tissue connecting the front and the back of the brain with the left hemisphere. The opposite is never true in all of anatomical studies. There's gross anatomical asymmetries between both hemispheres, and that this form follows function. So you're going to get some of this information when you read the vestibular paper, and over the next month, that's going to be one of your reading assignments, that you read through that vestibular paper and that you become familiar with the vestibular paper. If you do this, you'll be understanding what creates, through our psyche, what creates a condition where the immune system is lowered, what creates a condition, in fact, where there is a possibility of a tumour being created as a result of what's occurring in the psyche. So that's a very good idea to make sure that you read this paper and that you read it a few times.
That's quite all right. So we can think of eye movements or full body movements as a way to help our brain process. Yeah.
You're talking about internal dialect and football. Does that necessarily mean the person is not listening to you when you're talking to these guys' mind?
They could be listening to you with part of their neurology to the extent that they're, say, 50% talking to themselves inside. They would have maybe the other 50% of their auditory neurology available to hear what you're saying. And to the extent that they're involved in internal dialogue, that part is dissociated from external dialogue.
In other words, the more that I would see something out there in front of me, right, in my mind, the more space that would be taken away from the neurology that would be actually used to see something externally. Internal neurology, internal endogenous activity at certain levels of our neurology compete for exogenous activity. So if I've got something occurring in my brain in the auditory system and I'm hearing that, and I might not be aware of it, but that's going on inside my brain, then there's that much neurology which is not available for actual hearing of something on the outside.
As a whole brain person, you have the ability to process 3 or 4 things at one time, don't you?
We can process 7 or 8. You can be aware of a multitude of things.
And be efficient. Yeah.
It's possible, yes. However, you'll notice that if a person is occupying, like if I were talking away and you were listening to this, okay, and that you were listening and what I saw was this foot going like this. This is the pace that the foot is going, is the pace at which I'm occupying internal dialogue, because something is making this foot go like this, and it's the neurology which is wired to internal dialogue. Now I might not be aware of what it is that I'm saying. Maybe I'm humming a tune at that level. The main thing is that when this foot is going and I would be listening, part of my neurology would not be available for crossing threshold so that I would have the information for recall. I would have the information through association. So this is a hypnotic technique somewhat too, so that sometimes in fact there is a distraction occurring, and the distraction's occurring because then you are saying something whilst the distraction's occurring, the information's going in, so the person doesn't have the ability to recall it. Actually, oh yes, and then they have the ability to recall. But through association, like if I went back and said, can you remember me saying, and then I'd tell them what I said, and they'll say, oh yes, of course, that's right. Now that memory is through association. That's our strongest memory, by the way. And the person, because they heard the information in a dissociated state, it's possible that they don't have the information in an associated state. To be able to recall the information, you're in need of being in an associated state somewhat. The more that you can do that, the more likely it is, in fact, that you'll easily just have recall for it.
What does internal dialogue mean? Are we really talking about sex?
Sure, we really actually talk to ourselves inside. If you listen, if you're driving down the road in your car and all of a sudden you notice that you're having this conversation, you're thinking. There's actually an auditory component. You can hear it.
Share with Bruce what it was that what you've experienced in your life, and what has happened, and how you've come through all of this.
I take a lot of walks outside at night, and I notice myself saying, aha, and then I say something to myself. Actually, when I'm alone outside, I say it out loud to myself. And when I'm with other people, I would say the same thing to myself inside. If I think of what am I going to do tomorrow, I actually say that sentence to myself inside, and then I say the answer, and then I say the next answer, and I'm aware of the words being formed and being perceived.
Well, how does that differ from auditory construction?
I'm going to let you answer that because I was about to ask you.
Yes. I mean, the subject-object thing.
Okay. one is internal and one is much more involving external. Auditory construct is involving the expression of something, the actual expression of something, which is much more involving the left hemisphere, whereas internal dialogue is involving the right hemisphere more, a matrix of the left and right hemisphere more, where what's occurring is there's an internal loop occurring in the person's neurology, where, for instance, what was happening to Johnny and what is happening to everybody, you become aware of this. And the sages through the ages, this is the one thing that they would have you do to try to regulate your internal dialogue. And that they would say this is the quickest way to the top. What was happening to John and what happens to everybody, somebody is looking around and everything they look at, they're noticing, they're hearing themselves inside saying tree, fan, or if the person gets up, actually what enables the person to get up is that they've said something. In fact, most of these, if a person loses language function, sometimes this is a great deficit in their behaviour, because what was creating the behaviour was the person was giving themselves commands inside. Not that sometimes you are aware of this and there's a way to become aware that there's a possibility of it being there. So one day, some years ago, we were driving in the car and Johnny said to me, well, I mean, when you look at that sign, don't you say sign, don't you say building, don't you say trees, road? And what was happening is John's eyes shifted around. There was full of internal dialogue, and the internal dialogue was commenting on everything that he saw.
So what is the usefulness of being aware of our internal dialogue?
Okay, so the usefulness of it is, first of all, that if you're coaching yourself positively and what is being said is something which, is meaningful and something that you can use, then I think that's excellent. And I think for the most part, internal dialogue is words which are being censored often. So that when you're with somebody and that you have an internal dialogue to yourself, is this something that you can share with the person that you're with? Then I would say go ahead and share it, actually, and shape it.
With internal dialogue, you can read that in your behavior patterns?
Internal dialogue is sometimes what it is that's creating this person to do various things.
Yeah.
The main thing is that you'll notice that somebody like this is much more kind of going and functioning from a language, from a digital mode, more sequencing things rather than sometimes seeing the big picture. This kind of person is easy to get lost in the woods, because their focus is coming in like that rather than being out wide and kind of thinking of the big picture of where they've been or whatever. It's like when somebody gets inebriated a little with alcohol. What the alcohol does is it anesthetizes the right hemisphere, so all that's left kind of is a combination of the left, and so the person doesn't have the ability to kind of even do, sequence things like that, because what's left is this ability just to sequence without the whole. Anyway, the main thing is that internal dialogue is really often what messes someone's ability to be able to speak, for instance, because what they're doing is something else is happening whilst they're in an ability to be expressive. If you're in a mode in your brain that's involving introspection, which is internal dialogue involves, and you are trying to be in an expressive mode, it's like trying to do two things that are competing with each other. And you'll notice that when this occurs, there's more of a chopped upness. You'll notice that there's a loss of a sequencing ability, and you'll notice that even you start to lose your train of thought a little. Anyway, it's possible to be anywhere, Bruce, and be able to completely have whole brain functioning. The main thing is simply that this is the major highway over here to introspection. And now there's many wonderful things down this highway. And also one of the things down this highway is inhibition and also aversion and many other wonderful things too. But the main thing is this is the major highway to introspection, and down over here this is the major highway to expression.
So yesterday you said, yesterday you said that really good students were usually audio, visual, maybe kinesthetic, but they were audio, visual. And what I got out of that was that they would read the material, read it again, then see the material. And then now that to me is is that a form of maybe positive internal dialogue in terms of practicing a lesson or memorizing something?
Okay, so now the one thing here is that there is a way to look at what somebody is doing as they study, to see how streamlined their strategy is, because some people's strategies for studying is very complex, and there's a way to shorten what it is that occurs, so there's much more of a streamlined approach. Now it really depends on what you're studying. If you were studying a legal question, it's possible that the strategy that you cited would be an okay strategy for that. But if the strategy involved figuring out something that someone has said in the family, then I would say this strategy is not very effective. Because it would be important that this person was able to process what was said first through their feeling. And then what they would say, what they would hear first would come through their feeling. And then they would be using their eyes. If someone was sharing this, they would be using their eyes to exit. So that's a much more effective strategy than it would be for someone to be using auditory, visual, and then kinesthetic. And that this strategy, kinesthetic, auditory, visual, might not be as effective, if you were studying a legal question, perhaps. Especially memorizing the legal question. It may be may be better off using a strategy like the one you cited, auditory, visual, kinesthetic. The main thing is that to access whole brain functioning, you are having a preference for how you're feeling. Even if you are using this other strategy, you are still having a preference for how you're feeling.
So would that be how you set it up, in terms of you feel good about what you're studying, or you're enthusiastic about it? So that's where the feeling sets the primary foundation.
So what happens if you're studying statistics and it's absolutely boring as all hell? What do you do? What would you recommend?
Go play for real, mate.
Yes, maybe, to help relieve something. Okay, if you were practitioners, what would you advise this person? This person is studying statistics, and it's just like boring as all hell for the person, kind of. And they need to study this, right, to get where they need to go or something.
Would it help if they placed this book in a certain...
Yes.
Could you what?
Yes, excellent. So D is saying, first of all, that it would be real helpful if they were able to bring the book over to this side. That absolutely is going to be helpful, right?
You look at it from what side?
Because this is involving the ability to sequence, which is absolutely important in counting. So it would be important that the person shifted the material over to this side, and a gifted person is naturally doing that. Gifted children at school just naturally are taking the material to the aspect of the brain, in fact, which is quite involved. Okay, what else would you do now? This person is not interested. Come on.
Try to kick in the other side of the brain, but either by music or by...
Okay, so why would you be doing that actually? What would be the point of having some light music that doesn't have any digital component to it, but that's like more right brain, like the music we've been playing here?
To tune in the pleasure?
Yes. Okay, now if you were practitioners of whole brain functioning, alright, and somebody came to you and they said that, I'm studying statistics at the moment, is there something that you can do to help me? Then you would say, well, is this something that you're interested in? And the person says, no, I really kind of... So that's the first thing that you help them with. How can you become interested in this? How can you trick yourself to become interested in this? And so there's some strategies that we'll learn, okay, that you'll learn, that really brain processes that will enable a person to actually become interested. Okay, so sometimes, for instance, what I'll do is I'll look at the blackboard and I see these, Pearson's correlation coefficient on the board with this massive formula, right? And this is just frightening to see all these, these symbols and everything, right? And have to memorize how this equation is worked out. And